Hello, in this section we are going to go over creating and calling functions. We will cover what is a function, how do we call a function, parameters and return types, which are part of functions, and the differences between functions and methods. So let's get started by creating a new playground and deleting the string property. And we will cover what a function is first. So a function is a block of code that gets executed. So in our case, we can say do something with the keyword func in the beginning, and then we have an open brace and a close brace. So anything between an open brace and a closed brace is a chunk of code that gets executed. So in this case, we are naming this chunk of code called do something. And this do something, we will just print the string do something. To call this function, we just have to call it by saying do something with the open and closed brace. And when that's called, it will execute the code that is within open brace and the closed brace, in this case that print statement that prints out do something to the console, as we can see below. Functions can also have parameters. So let's create another function called do something with a parameter. And we'll say a parameter. So this is the name of the parameter. And now we have a colon, and we have to tell it what type the parameter is. In this case, it will be type string. So now we can just print a parameter. So again, we have the open brace and the closed brace, and in between here, we have code that will be executed. In this case, we're going to print a parameter. So whatever we pass into this function will get printed to the console. So let's call do something with a parameter. And we can't just pass anything in here because it is expecting a string. So let's just pass in the string something. So now something gets printed to the console. So let's create another function, and we will call this do something without an external parameter. So we have internal and external parameters. So by default, when we create this a parameter, we have an internal a parameter, which is used inside of our function, and we have an external a parameter, which is used when we are calling the function. So when we make this function do something without an external parameter, we provide an underscore saying that we don't care about the external parameter, and then we do a parameter, which is the internal parameter, and we make it of type string, and then we can print a parameter, because this is the internal parameter name. And when we call it, we call do something without an external parameter, and we just pass in the string. We're saying no external parameter. Notice the difference here. We just have our string here, whereas before, when we had an external parameter, we had a parameter colon something. In this case, we can omit that. Now let's look at a function that returns a value. So we have func do something with a return value. We won't pass any parameters, and instead we'll use this dash with a right angle bracket, and we will return a string. And now the code that we're going to execute, instead of just printing to the console, we will return something. We will say return do something. So you noticed before it was yelling at us that we needed to return something, and what we have to return is whatever type that we have here. So in this case we have a string. This could also be an int or a double, or any of our own types that we create. And then we have to return that here in order to exit. And we call this function the same way that we have before. We do something with a return value, and that will return something, but notice that we're not doing anything with it. So we can print do something with a return value, and now that will print do something to the console. The last thing I want to cover here is the differences between a function and a method. So everything that we've created so far have been functions, just kind of live in their own scope. But if we were to have our own type, so in this case let's create a struct called a method in a struct. And inside of here, we will use the keyword func called do something and print do something. What we're actually doing here is creating a method. So anytime you see a function that belongs to a type, in this case a method in a struct, that is actually a method. If we see func outside of any of our types, this is considered a function, and it's at a global scope. Whereas this method belongs to our struct. So anytime you have a struct or a class and you have a function inside of there, they are actually methods. In a lot of places you will see them used interchangeably, and that's fine. You're probably confuse them as well, but usually when you refer to methods, you're referring to something that belongs to a type, in this case a struct or a class, and a function refers to the global scope. Throughout the course you're going to see more advanced functions and methods, but all it's really doing is executing some block of code that is reusable. So anytime that you're going to use something more than once, you want to break that off into a function. In the next video, we're going to cover the differences between classes and structs, and go over the differences between value types and reference types. See you then.